The following program does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, on Reality Radio 101. So, get ready to talk, email, or post a message to us. We are looking forward to speaking with you and responding to your questions. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, right to your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowski.
Dr. Anna Baranowski, bearing witness to evolving mind, mood, health. I'm really delighted to speak with you. If you have any questions or want to share some thoughts or comments, please do get in touch with us at instudio101@gmail.com. I know that when we have an opportunity to really dialogue about these things and open up the conversation, it really brings a deeper and profound understanding. I mean, you are part of the solution, and being part of the conversation just makes it so rich for everyone. I want to start by talking a little bit about the history of, how addictions have been viewed in our culture. And, let's first just be very clear about this. Psychoactive drugs have been used since the earliest of human civilization. And the idea that people can become addicted or that substances can become a problem has been observed since around the 17th century. So, there's been a kind of evolution of addiction treatment since the mid-18th century to the present. And, as we, watch how people have been treated over time, we have to be aware of the history where it came from, the perspectives that people had, and the idea that, some things don't work too very well, because I think we've gotten off track on why people really get engaged in addictions, why it's so hard for some people to stop, what it really even means, when we start using larger and larger quantities of a substance, even though we may want to stop, but instead we end up spending a lot of our time, pursuing the drug of choice, whatever that might be, and, we have making it more difficult, very strong cravings, and disrupting the things that we like to do or that we have obligations to do. And even though we may be having very big difficulties as a result of the substances we're using, or the addicted behaviors, we may find it really very difficult to stop. So let's just talk a little bit about what happened in the early 1750s, early 1800s. Now, there were these, it started with the Alcoholic Mutual Aid Societies. There were these like sobriety circles that provided some support and recovery around 1750 to early 1800s. And these groups were originally made up of the kind of North American Native American tribes. And, they focused on abstinence. And they used a lot of the native healing practices to actually address these struggles. Now, a fellow named Benjamin Rush argued that alcoholism was a disease that could be treated, and Rush was really, putting a lot of energy into educating people about, why alcohol or excessive use of alcohol was problematic, and began to launch what was called the temperance movement, which did not necessarily go so well. Then in the 1800s, there were these lodging homes for what they called homes for the fallen, societies where people would come together when they were struggling with alcohol addiction. Primarily, it was alcohol addiction at that time that they were treating in these homes. And, people went in voluntarily, and they stayed to try to, get away from the drinking culture that they may have been engaged in, and immersing themselves in, culture where there was fellowship. So people were connecting with each other. Now, that piece of it seemed to actually make a difference, the connection part. Following these connection societies gave people a sense of community. And I'll talk a little bit more about the importance of that and why it's actually very important in understanding addictions. Now, here's an interesting piece of news. Freud recommended using cocaine to treat alcoholism and morphine addiction in the 1880s. And in fact, he started using cocaine himself, calling it a magic drug, which I'm sure it was quite magical for him. And he, would encourage this use of cocaine. And in fact, by the end of his life, closer to the end of his life, he recognized that, using cocaine to treat morphine and alcohol addiction was probably just another addiction, and also could cause, significant problems. So, he changed his beliefs on that. And I don't think he really got to the point of the matter of, what are the real core problems that lead somebody to struggle with addiction. So, what was happening at that point was, people who were struggling with drinking would go to these drunk tanks and wards and hospitals, but, they weren't really getting treatment for the core impact. Why were they turning to alcohol in the first place? So that was not really happening initially. So it was like poorly understood. So in the 1900s to the 1950s, there was an increase of awareness that people needed to have some kind of treatment, and there was a Charles B. Towns hospital that opened, and this was in New York City in 1901, and the alcoholics that went there, in fact, had to be likely quite affluent, because it was a very expensive treatment at that time. And in fact, it seems to me that a lot of these treatment centers, the good ones, do tend to be quite expensive, which is really unfortunate, because I believe that anybody who is struggling from an addiction, deserves to have access to the best care, because, we really are talking about something that, has some real core features to it and drivers. And I'm going to talk about the features and the drivers shortly. So stick along with me for that, because it is an important issue. So then, treatment started to move forward, and there was an understanding that there needed to be some kind of combination of spirituality and psychological intervention. And this laid the groundwork for the Alcoholics Anonymous groups that came together. And it's so interesting, how one thing laid the step for the next thing. And, in many of our lives, we have to actually recognize that sometimes we have to take one step before we get to another step. So, if you find yourself struggling with an addiction and you've noticed it's really hard to, get off of whatever your addiction of choice is, please just recognize that whatever you're doing today may be the perfect step for where you are today, and it may lead you to the next step. Just keep your eyes open and your heart open, and recognize that there'll be a next step if you allow it. So then in the 1910s, now this gets really quite gruesome. There was a passage of state laws that called for sterilization of individuals who struggled with addiction. Well, also for those who had mental illness, were developmentally delayed, but along with that, they put in people who had addictions of various kinds. So this was actually approved. The legislation granted medical supervisors of these treatment places to authorize the sterilization of individuals. So it's kind of a shocking outcome that people who were struggling were then punished for their struggles. By the 1919, morphine maintenance clinics were created to help people who were struggling with morphine addiction, and that was again a period of time where they were not necessarily addressing the underlying factors of why were people driven to this struggle. Why is it that some people can just drink once in a while and they can be okay, and other people find themselves in a very hardcore addiction. So as I was saying before, some of the early stages of treatment led to Alcoholics Anonymous, which was actually formed in 1934 by 4 founding members, who one of them for sure was very involved in getting treatment prior for himself, Bill Wilson, who himself recognized himself to be really struggling with alcohol addiction, and was looking for a way to deal with that. And he was influential in helping move this Alcohol Anonymous group forward. And AA has a huge impact on the world today, and it creates fellowship, and it creates an opportunity for people to understand what they needed in order to recover. Now, I've worked with a lot of people who come to me and they have addictions, and because of the work that I do with trauma, I often find that trauma and addictions, they tend to go really hand in hand. I see a lot of them that a lot of individuals who really struggle with trauma have turned to addictions, and so underlying trauma can be a very big driver to turning to addictions of various sorts. And believe me, addictions come in a lot of different forms. So I'm not talking about alcohol alone. I'm talking about a lot of different things, and I'll talk about that shortly as well. So I think one of the most amazing things that the Alcoholics Anonymous, the AA groups, have provided is a place where people can come and feel that they are accepted, and they can be seen and heard and understood, and that they can also feel a sense of pride in their accomplishments. They get these chips or recognition tokens at the end of certain milestones, like a month or a year, and they start to really kind of feel increasingly good about their achievements. But they also have fellowship. They turn to each other in ways that are pretty important. And I have seen a lot of my clients go on to AA programs of various sorts, whether it's sex addiction or Narcotics Anonymous or eating struggles, that they find that they have a group of people around them, and they just feel that the connection is almost the most important thing in helping them recover. And I think that makes perfect sense to me. So there's also things like anti-abuse, which is being used since the 1948, 1950. And it's a drug, actually, that helps individuals discontinue their use of alcohol, because when they take antabuse, it leaves them feeling nauseous, and they get these really uncomfortable reactions to drinking alcohol. And so it's being used to help actually not only alcohol at this point, but also barbiturates, amphetamines, and this seems to be making a difference as well. I mean, I always think that it's good to be informed and figure out, what are the many, many ways in which you can help yourself. So, I think that, recognizing that, you can find a lot of different strategies. It's really important. I'm going to just go to email right now, and we have an email from Scott. Hello, Scott, and thank you so very much for writing in. Scott says, hello, Dr. B, a very interesting topic as usual. What is your take on cannabis now being legal in Canada? I am all for any drug that has true medicinal purposes, but do we really need another recreational drug to give to folks who already have addictions? Bad idea, in my opinion. Well, Scott, I actually believe that there are a lot of problems with prohibiting use. Now, of course, cannabis is something that people can struggle with, and actually any substance is. I mean, but it's not the substance so much that is the problem, but the underlying drivers for why somebody uses a particular substance. I'm going to cover that in a study called the Rat City, actually. So I want you to hold that thought, because I'm going to come back to it. I think it's really important that we recognize that, in fact, prohibition, stopping access to substances of various types doesn't seem to help reduce addiction in any way. There's really no evidence for that. So, there are some places in the world that have very effectively allowed most or all substances to be freely accessed, and much to our surprise, in fact, addictions are going down, not because the substances are available, but because of other things that they are doing that are really making a huge difference and evolving society and the drivers for addiction. So I will return to that, because it's a fantastic question, and I really appreciate you asking it. So let me go back to history, which I find very interesting. So in the 1950s, I said AA started to be available, and it's amazing because it very quickly took on a huge membership, and by the early 1950s, it surpassed 90,000 members. Can you imagine? So, within a really short period of time, AA was making a difference. And this I really completely understand, because they're doing a couple of things that are very, very important. People are now being seen and heard and understood. They have community around us. I'm going to come back to that issue, because it is absolutely at the core of why people struggle and what needs to be done in order for people to really get into recovery. So the Veterans Administration also began to provide care and treatment. By 1957, their network was providing treatment for addictions, and that was making a big difference as well. And then there was this, movement called the Halfway House that was also very involved around the same time, 1958, where people were going away to these homes to work on, abstinence and developing strategies for struggles with substance abuse problems. And, it also became, very apparent to the insurance industry at that point that people needed to recognize that alcoholism, let's say, and addictions were a disease, and that there needed to be proper treatment or medication to help people who were struggling. And that is a very important thing, because, making sure that people have a place to go is hugely important, and various different strategies, including, the use of, let's say, acupuncture, which started to become popular around 1970. People started to use acupuncture to deal with addictions to some, benefit. I mean, certainly it did help. It's a strategy that is often included in interdisciplinary response. So, acupuncture alone, I wouldn't suggest is going to stand on its own, but I think when you embed it in with many other different approaches, it can be very helpful. And, then it became very clear that, people needed to find a variety of different ways to help, whether it's, cocaine addiction or other kind of substance that people were using, that there had to be different ways of addressing this. So I know a lot of people ended up going to Alcoholics Anonymous because they were struggling with alcohol, but, it became very apparent that many people have a kind of what I would call the drug of choice. So AA became, a branch off of, many anonymous options like, Cocaine Anonymous and Overeaters Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. It just really branched out. And it's interesting because sometimes I find that people go into treatment and they don't necessarily go into treatment for the specific drug of choice. Sometimes they'll find a group that really works for them and they'll stick with that, and that seems to really make a difference. There's also other drugs that are being used, like antabuse. Now they use something, for opioid receptors in the brain, so that if you're addicted to an opioid, you can take a different kind of drug to help you block that, and then the pleasurable effects of taking an opioid drug, let's say for example, are no longer useful because you've got something that's blocking that, and that can be very helpful as well when people are struggling with opioid addiction. So there are many different things that we can consider in terms of the addictions field, but one of the things I want you to realize is addictions come in many different forms. I want to just go back to our listeners, and Steve is saying hello. Is addiction a product of genes, genetics, sex addiction, for example, or a product of our human environment, pornography? I've heard both arguments. Thank you. So, let's take a moment and just contemplate this very famous work by Bruce Alexander in the 1970s. He was actually a professor of psychology in Vancouver, and he did this really interesting experiment. And so I'm actually going to address some of what you're asking here, Steve, by talking a little bit about this experiment. So what was happening in this experiment was that a rat would be put in a cage all alone, and, that rat would have access to two forms of liquid, and the rat would drink the liquid that had a drug in it, and they would drink the drugged water all day, virtually killing themselves if they could, because they had nothing else going on, and it was a very sterile environment, and they had no companionship. And rats, like humans, are very social creatures. And what would happen is if they took these rats and they put them in a larger cage called Rat Park, it was a great cage with lots of colored balls and great rat food and lots of tunnels. And I think there were 20 different rats put into each cage. And there was a lot going on, and they had the same water to choose from. And what did they do? They did not choose the drug-fueled liquid. They chose water. And these were rats that were already addicted. So it's interesting. You would think that, the rat is addicted, and, there you're going to have a rat who is addicted with heroin, which is, or cocaine. Both are highly addictive. And you would, imagine that the rat would just go and drink some more of that cocaine or heroin laced water, but they didn't. What they did when they were in these environments where there were other rats and social interaction and games to play and tunnels and food and, all the things that they needed to be stimulated and engaged, they did not continue with the addiction. They would connect and engage with the world around them. They were enjoying their lives, and they didn't like the drugged water. So, those isolated rats, it's almost like they didn't have a chance. No matter what their genetic material was, they just didn't have a chance if they were in an isolated, terrible environment. And if they were in a social and wonderful environment, they were doing okay. So it's not that none of them would drink the water with the drug in it, but none of them died. So in the isolated situation, those rats, they would drink the laced water until they would die, many of them. But while they were, happy and in this great environment, they just were not motivated to drink this laced water until they died. So, Bruce Alexander was contemplating, why that would happen, and what was going on that would create that, and whether it was merely because they were rats and not humans, and would the same thing happen if you had human beings. But the interesting thing is that with human beings, almost at the very same time when Professor Alexander was doing his research, the Vietnam War was going on. So this was unfortunately, a human experiment of a sort. And it was being tracked very, very closely. And what was happening was that a lot of individuals who were overseas would be using heroin. It was very, very common. It was actually incredibly common for the U.S. troops to be addicted to heroin, maybe even up to 20% of the U.S. soldiers. And, they were tracking, U.S. military was tracking this, and they were very worried that what was going to happen is that they were going to bring back people to the U.S. and that there was going to be a huge number of people struggling with heroin addiction once they were here. But the reality of that is that about 95% of the soldiers who were addicted to heroin when they were in Vietnam, at least according to the studies, and there was a lot of tracking of this, they just stopped. They did. Some had rehab, most did not. But what had happened was very much like Rat Park experiment, was that they went from a very terrifying situation where they were not engaged in their normal activities to a pleasant life in which they really didn't want to, use that drug anymore. It just wasn't compelling in the same way. So they simply were able to nourish themselves in ways that were more meaningful. So this is it's so compelling, because what it says to us is we're looking at drugs from the wrong point of view, that we can't assault people when they're struggling and addicted to a drug or an activity of choice. We got to realize that something's going on in their environment, in their lives, in the depths of who they are as human beings, that is leaving them feeling that they cannot be nourished, and they aren't being nourished. So it became very important to figure out, what is it that is keeping these individuals in our society from feeling like they are nourished enough. And that's really, important, that we don't blame people who are addicted, but we figure out, what are we doing wrong as a society that people are turning to addiction. So I'm going to go back to our listeners. Hi, Ty. Ty is saying, isn't the first step of any addiction the admission of the addict to admit that they actually have a problem? If they do not do that, isn't that part of the problem? Thank you. Well, yes. I mean, that's really a tenet of Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, that's where AA started. In most of the AA or anonymous groups, people stand up and say, "Hi, my name is so and so, and I'm addicted, or I'm addicted to, whatever the drug of choice is." And yes, it's great to be able to recognize that we are struggling with something, to be seen and heard. But the reality is that, let's go back to the rat study. Those rats, they didn't see themselves as addicts. They just stopped. Now, if we're going to be struggling with an addiction, and we really, really are, in a situation where we cannot get ourselves out of the drug of choice, it's really helpful to find ourselves in community. And, one of the things about, admitting that we have a problem is often, and this is where the AA tenet comes from, we are admitting it to our peers. And then we're getting that support amongst our peers. And there's something really powerful about that, because I don't now have to sit alone and say, I'm addicted, and I don't know what to do. I'm looking at a room full of people who recognize that they've been through this, and they see me as worthy of care and attention. And that just seems very right to me. It does not seem to make sense for people to have to go into terrible isolation, in any way. So, Eamon, hi. Eamon is writing in and saying, I'm a recovering alcoholic. Thank you so much, Eamon, for sharing that. But we are never really recovering, as we are coping on a daily basis with this demon. But I can attest that positive, supportive people around you daily helps, and a big part of recovery. So, Eamon, I know this remarkable clinician, therapist in Toronto. Her name is Patricia Davis, and she runs this really fantastic group called the Heart Group, and the Heart Group is really focused on helping, in this case, first responders. They come together, and they come together every single week, and they talk about what their struggles are, and they are not alone for that 1 hour. They are amongst a community of peers, and if they're struggling with addictions or trauma, whatever the struggle is, in most cases, with Patricia, I know that her group has really opened their arms to people who struggle with addiction. And, I really agree with you. Sometimes we have to understand that we live with the inner wound and the drive to use whatever our addiction of choice is, because it at least initially has a way of softening the power of that pain, that inner pain that most of us struggle with when we have faced some kind of addiction. So, I think your recognition that, you have to keep on track and understand that things are not just going to go away, but you have to own that there is an inner wound and that, it does need your attention. So, Bob, hi, Bob. Bob asks, are there any risk factors to addiction? Well, yeah, absolutely. Certainly there's huge risk factors. One of them is basically, dying. It's not something to be taken lightly. It also, for most people, When you have a real active addiction, it's going to disrupt your work, your school, your home life, your relationships with people you care about, how you function in every single area of your life, your health. And, depending on what the addiction is, it can have huge impact on your physical well-being. So, there's no question, and it really depends on the addiction, but, whatever the addiction is, generally, even if it's like over-exercising, this can be an addiction, and this can also have a detrimental effect. So, whatever the addiction is, it actually can lead to a pretty bad outcome. So there's no question that addictions have huge risk factors. I want to talk a little bit about addictions you might not know that you have. So most people recognize, that if they're smoking or they're drinking or they use cocaine, that they have an addiction and that it can cause problems. But the reality is that addictions can come in a lot of different forms, and, forms that we sometimes don't expect. So, for example, somebody might have an addiction to work. They're overworking, and, they're not giving attention to their lives in general. And it can be very problematic because, especially in our culture, we have an idea that work is good and that, we need to get focused on our work and get ahead and do well. But the reality is that sometimes working and overworking can keep us from really facing ourselves. Maybe we're lonely, or we don't have close connections, or, really great social skills. And so instead, we'll get focused highly on just putting all of our energy into work. And this is especially true for people who have done really well in their work or get some level of recognition for their work. So the internet can also be an addiction. I'm sure most of us have seen young people who are struggling with, a video game or a role-playing game, and, they are just not able to pull themselves out. And I've spoken with many parents who really are afraid for their children's well-being because the focus of their attention is almost entirely on playing their game of choice. And this can be very difficult because they're really not engaged in the life around them. Now, again, part of the issue here is then why would that be? What would really be going on that instead of wanting to connect in their world, they may find themselves really not doing that? Remember the rat park, those rats, when they found themselves in community and they had food and other activities to engage in, they just didn't choose their drug of choice. But in fact, humans, we're not so quick to re-engage in the world around us, and that is especially true if we have felt shamed in our world, if there's a human element to our not wanting to engage in healthy activity. So this becomes, part of the problem. So part of what needs to happen is a culture that is engaging in a healthy, supportive way that minimizes shame and increases inclusiveness. And that just doesn't always happen because it seems that there is a tendency in some ways toward shame. And when people have that as part of their history, shame, then turning towards some kind of addiction to get out of discomfort can be the choice, because there's a feeling of discomfort in human community. They don't feel that they can trust. People sometimes don't feel that they can trust those that are around them. And that is a really unfortunate thing. But that is exactly what can happen when we find ourselves, maybe having grown up in a world where, or in a community where, people have not treated us well. I did a a YouTube video called Traumatic Loneliness. And what I was really talking about is the struggle that we might have around, feeling that it's safe to connect with other people because we've been hurt so badly. So when we're hurt terribly, it becomes important for us to understand that we now also need to find human community where there is a clarity about leaning toward each other in respect and appreciation and understanding, and that it doesn't necessarily just go away. So, hi, Cody. Cody is also writing in and asking, why is it that some people get addicted to drugs or alcohol and some do not? And again, I want to talk a little bit about, this idea of any drug at all, any source, any addiction at all can be very, very difficult to deal with. And I think that a huge piece of addiction is shame. Addiction is driven by trauma, and addiction is driven by loneliness or poor resources. And when we deal with these things and we find ways to connect that allow us to feel safe and understood, that can be a huge change. And I do think that there are elements that are related to genetics, but I think that from what I've read and what I see, it seems to me that the most significant issue of the over 22 million people in the U.S. who have an addiction, it's not all genetics. I think most of it is related to environment, previous trauma, shame, and just finding themselves in situations that make life emotionally difficult to face. So let's talk about some other addictions. So there's also caffeine, of course, and you might find that it actually is an addiction, and you may find that in fact you want to drink more and more and more because it speeds you up and it gets you engaged. But if you reduce your caffeine use, then you will find some physical discomfort. But with caffeine addiction, there are a lot of symptoms that actually are a little bit surprising, that are significant risk factors like chest pain, fatigue, nausea, headaches. So, even though it may seem fairly benign, oh yeah, I drink coffee. I'm sure everybody, who drinks coffee just feels like it's something that, adds something pleasant to your day. So should be fine, right? But yeah, if you drink a lot of coffee, you can actually end up in the hospital, believe it or not. Television. Well, what about being addicted to television? Do you think that that's a possibility? Sometimes, people will just tune out from the world. That sounds good. Sometimes, there's a lot going on, and watching a couple of shows is a great outlet. But in fact, it's also something that can be used to numb our emotions, remove ourselves from feelings of stress and loneliness and sadness, and just tune out of our life. So, that stops being about relaxing for an hour or two, and it starts being about really struggling with not wanting to face life. And in fact, I've heard people say that they cannot wait until they can get away from the demands of their day and just sit in front of the TV, and they start actually wanting to get out of their social engagement so that they don't have to do anything but watch TV. And then there is sex addiction, which is a real thing. And, they something like 5 to 10% have struggle with something called love addiction. And, this is about the sense of being preoccupied with, having that loving adoration, and that this kind of emotional high from a new relationship is what people are seeking. So it's not even so much that, they want a long-term happy relationship, but that they're looking for a very high level of oxytocin, which is this drug that gets released, which is quite pleasant. And it's related to these feelings of this deep sense of early love, and also sex addiction, which is, something that really can cause a lot of trouble in a person's life, because, it can be a driver that keeps them from being in a significant personal relationship, or even worse, starts to undermine or spoil their relationship. What about negativity? Is that an addiction? Is that something that people can become addicted to? It's interesting because many of us have met people who seem to only see things in a negative light. Life always looks bleak, and there's always something to complain about. Now, I wonder what would happen to a person who is trying to change their negative thoughts and stimulate more positive ones. Does negativity have a deep-rooted cause, or possibly an emotional, traumatic core to it? So, that's something to contemplate as well. There's also something called exercise addiction. It's recognized, where people actually experience withdrawal symptoms if they haven't exercised for a day or more, and they start feeling irritability and anxiety and even possibly guilt. Now, I said this before, but exercising too much can actually lead you to injure yourself. So the body actually does need downtime, so that it can heal and recover. And I always think it's good to let your body rest. And in fact, there are some athletes who, take extended periods of time away from exercise. Some very well-known athletes who take up to a month away from exercise, so that their body can heal and repair, and that they can focus on their, rebuilding their body back. And it's interesting because there's certain kinds of exercise that if you stop doing it for a long period of time, it tends to go away. The benefits of it tend to go away faster, like cardio exercise tends to go away quicker, the benefits of that. But if you're weight training or resistance training, then you can actually keep yourself, your muscles in condition for a longer period of time if you step away from it. So don't worry if you take a little break from exercise. That's a normal thing to do. Some people are also addicted to picking and scratching their faces or hangnails or their hair, and that's a real thing as well. So there's a lot of things that people can get addicted to, and shopping. And shopping, of course, can be very dangerous, and there are clearly people who have found themselves in big debt as a result of their need to buy more and more expensive things, and that's quite unfortunate as well. So here is another question. Hi, love the show. How does someone actually know if they're addicted to something? I drink about 2 glasses of wine just about every night after dinner, after a very hard and stressful day as a broker. I do this 5 nights a week, and then if I get out in the weekend to socialize, I might have 2 or 3 drinks at the restaurant, bar, or club. Help. Am I an alcoholic? Well, there are ways of actually figuring out if you are a alcoholic, or if you are, finding yourself really having problems with an addiction. And, one of the biggest things is that if you're using a substance, whether it's alcohol or anything else, then you're using the substance and you're engaging it, and you want to be involved in that activity or the use of the substance for longer and longer periods of time, and you need larger and larger quantities to get the same effect, or you are drinking more or using your substance of choice more often and with larger quantities than you want to or intend. In addition, you want to stop. So let's say you go out for a night of drinking, you want to stop, but you find that, in fact, you keep ordering more, or let's say you have a shopping addiction or a coffee addiction or an eating addiction. You want to stop, but you just find yourself unable to put the brakes on and say, look, I had that one drink and I'm good now, and that's what I wanted, so now I'm stopping. If you can't do that, that's a pretty strong sign that there's something going on here. Or let's say you're spending too much time just trying to get that substance of choice, whether it's, buying some expensive piece of clothing, or, getting cocaine, or, having your drink. Are you, structuring your life around doing that thing or finding that substance? Are your cravings really strong? Like, do you notice that they come up and that, you just overwhelmed with the need for that, whatever the substance of choice is? And do they interrupt the things that you really need to do? Like, are you drinking so much that you can't get up in the morning? Or are you promising something to somebody and then, you drop the ball because you drank so much that you just couldn't attend to what it was you promised? Are you not able to deliver your work in time? Those are really important markers. Is this disrupting the things that are important to you in your life? And if so, then are you continuing to use this drug of choice, despite the huge impact that it's having, on your life? Because if it is, then for sure you want to be thinking about why are you continuing to do this thing? So, one of the things that I want to share with you is this really beautiful piece that I came across, this YouTuber who was writing about or speaking about being addicted to alcohol. In this case, this was her drug of choice, and she's quite a young woman, and she has a YouTube channel called Addicted to Happy. So if you're interested in this and you want more information about it, then I would just suggest that you listen to the YouTube video, and she talks about 12 lessons from 4 years of sobriety. So she's been sober for 4 years, and her experience is that she had been increasingly drinking to the point of on one occasion having to go to the hospital with her friend because she was so unwell. And she woke up the next day obviously feeling terrible, and with the epiphany that if she continued down this road, she would likely die. And probably she was right, because in fact, when you find yourself that ill, chances are you're going to continue with the same behavior if you don't do something very, very different. So she recognized correctly that she was in a very dangerous situation, and she was able to say, you know what, I want to stop this. And she had to undertake a real big change in her life. She realized that, her friendships had to change. She had to let go of the people that she knew, because what did she do with her friends? She went out to bars. She wasn't having a real connection with these people necessarily. That she had to spend a lot of time on her own personal growth, exploring her own truth, going to therapy, and that she found that, in fact, there was real purpose in allowing herself to feel the sadness and emotional pain she was experiencing. It was showing her something. And that in that, she could start to really accept what was going on in her life, to understand that, yes, this is where she was in her world right now, and that, the direction her life was taking, the sadness that she felt, that was part of her healing. And that in order for her to really heal, she had to stop using her substance of choice, because it was distracting her. It was keeping her away from really doing the work she needed to do on herself, and that she didn't need the approval from the people she thought she needed approval from. So sometimes what happens is, we'll get in amongst a group of people and, they have a certain behavior pattern, and that might include using cocaine or drinking a lot or whatever it is. And we start, we don't want to lose that friendship group, but they are, in the end, may not turn out to be the people who help us be who we really want to be authentically. So, being aware of, whose approval are you really looking for? And that the inner voice, the longing, the craving, it starts to get quieter over time. That, self-destructiveness starts to fade away. And that, over time, it's possible to be more and more in the present moment rather than being driven by the underlying addiction. And that you can find out that, in fact, you're way stronger than you had ever thought, which is, in itself also a very, very beautiful thing. I want to talk a little bit about this really remarkable position that Portugal took in 2001. They had this huge problem with addiction, and they were, punishing people. They took the role of, we'll punish them, and then, they won't use it anymore. But of course, that wasn't working. So in Portugal, they began to focus on, first they decriminalized all addictions, all substances, and then you would think, well, if those substances are available, then of course everybody's going to use them. But no, that's not what happened, because instead of spending money on incarceration, Portugal focused its efforts on helping addicts connect with a larger human community. And what they did was they would help people get jobs. They would help people feel that they're part of something important. They would give them an opportunity to feel trusted and connected. And people, once they started having jobs and an opportunity to recover and a sense of being respected, they would stop using drugs as much. In fact, in Portugal, what happened, instead of an increase in drug use, the drug use started to go down. In fact, drug use among adolescents started to go down. Drug deaths started to diminish. Drug-related harm started to go down. Overcrowding in prisons stopped being as much of a problem. The fact that people were worried about substance use worsening, in Portugal, it did not happen like that. But I think what Portugal did that was primarily of importance is they recognized that instead of punishing people with addiction, they ensured that everybody who was struggling with an addiction had an opportunity for their own growth and recovery, and were included. They were included in future opportunity for jobs and personal growth. And that's what we need to do. We need to help people who are struggling be well and be part of the larger human community. Now, we have one last email, and this is from Gwen. Hi, Gwen, a new listener here from Fredericton, New Brunswick. Well, hello. So glad that you're here. Gwen says, fantastic show. I know 2 people close to me that are addicts, and I can tell you this, it affects me just as much as them. I completely understand that, and it makes sense to me, Gwen, that you would be suffering because you love your friends and you want them to be well. So one of the things I would suggest is you might want to see if they would listen to the Johann Hari. Johann Hari is a journalist, and he has an amazing YouTube video. It's got almost 6,600,000 views, more now, and it's a TED Talk, and he talks about what really causes addiction, and he talks about the reality that, we are struggling with addictions usually because there's something very personal and very deep within inside of ourselves that is leaving us feeling unwell, traumatized, and that there are ways to recover. And he recognizes in his talk, just how important it is that we have good community around us, love and connection, and a willingness to grow. So I would suggest that you watch that yourself. It's called Everything You Think You Know About Addiction is Wrong, Johann Hari. And I'm going to stop on that. And I want to thank everybody so much for your comments today and being involved in this conversation. I hope that you have a great week, and I will look forward to talking to you next month. Wishing you a gentle day.
Thank you for listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We are Reality Radio 101.